Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Parsons Technical Webinar Series. I'm your host, Jessica Bennett. Today, we have with us Thomas Trachtenberg and Heather Budzik with us presenting on the Inactive Landfill Initiative, addressing emerging contaminants in drinking water. A few housekeeping items up front. We'll be keeping all phone lines muted until the Q&A session at the end to keep background noise down. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can ask them anytime in the chat feature, and we'll answer them at the end. You can also hold your questions and ask them live at the end if you wish. This webinar has been approved for one Professional Development Hour credit, or PDH. If you'd like to receive credit for it, you can complete and return the attendance form. We'll be posting a link to that in the chat a couple times throughout the webinar. There are 4 multiple choice questions you'll have to answer to get the PDH credit. And we'll also post this in the chat in case you have any issues downloading the form. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Parsons YouTube channel in the next few days. So a brief agenda, I'll introduce our 2 guest speakers, followed by a core value moment and a technical presentation, and then we'll wrap up at the end with a Q&A session. So to introduce our 2 speakers today, Thomas Trachtenberg, or Tom, has over 23 years of experience in engineering and project and portfolio management, ranging from small-scale projects involving in-situ treatment technologies to leading large-scale, high-profile mega projects involving sediment remediation, as well as statewide emerging contaminant landfill assessments. Heather has over 22 years of engineering and project management experience. Her recent roles include supporting implementation of a statewide emerging contaminant program, managing installation and operation of a horizontal soil vapor extraction system, managing investigation of a fractured bedrock site with an in-situ pilot study, and supporting pre-demolition and demolition activities for advancing a site toward remedial action. And with that, I'll hand it off to Heather for the core value moment.
Thanks, Jessica. Tom, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Today's core value moment is quality and what quality means in the work environment. Quality means anything we generate, reports, figures, tables, budgets, schedule, anything that we generate, quality should be built in. It means meeting specifications and project requirements, presenting information accurately, meeting the expectations of the client, and producing deliverables on time and within budget. Don't feel like quality applies only to large design projects or a project with a multi-million-dollar budget. Quality should be at the core of anything that we do and anything we generate. It should be an automatic step in the process of deliverable development. You can incorporate quality by implementing Parsons' principles of plan, act, check, excel, which is essentially a checks and balance system. Whether you're a project manager, technical director, or a junior team member, make sure that you set up a method for anything you generate to be reviewed against the original source of information. The overall benefits of having a quality system in place are reduced project costs by minimizing rework, and it leads to increased customer satisfaction, expectations, and confidence overall. We'll talk about quality a little bit later on within the program, but at this time, I'll turn it back over to Tom.
Okay, thanks, Jessica, and thanks, Heather, and thank you to everybody for joining in. Yeah, we're here to talk about the Inactive Landfill Initiative program. This is a project that Parsons has been fortunate enough to work side by side on with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation since 2017. Now, the origins of the program began with impacted drinking water, which was found in the town of Hoosick Falls, New York in 2016, where one of the contributing factors was identified as an inactive landfill facility. In response to this event, New York State put a specific focus on solid waste sites and inactive landfills to assess for potential impacts they may be having on the state's drinking water supply in other places. An immediate need was recognized by the state to consolidate all of the knowledge and data of those sites within the state and start a process of evaluating these sites for potential impacts to the various drinking water supplies. In 2017, Title 12 under Part 360, Article 27 was released, which laid out the plan for investigating the sites and any subsequent mitigation and remediation measures that would be deemed necessary where drinking water sources had been found to be impacted. The execution of Title 12 has come to be known as the Inactive Landfill Initiative. There's two main objectives of the program, and those were to create a solid waste site mitigation and remediation priority list based on impacts to drinking water supplies, and to develop and submit a comprehensive plan designed to mitigate and remediate those sites where impacted drinking water quality has been found or risks to public health. Now, that plan was to be updated on an annual basis to track additions, changes, and progress. And the latest update to that plan was released in summer of 2023. And so the data that we present herein is current through that update, which is through March 31st of 2023. The focus of the program is on emerging contaminants, primarily PFAS and 1,4-dioxane, though we also include analysis for traditional contaminants of concern, such as VOCs, SVOCs, metals, those kinds of things. The investigation targets legacy solid waste disposal sites where waste materials are known or suspected to have been disposed of. The ongoing program includes an evaluation of more than 1,900 inactive landfills if they fit one of a handful of categories. One, if they were operated prior to the established environmental regulations within the state. Two, if there are suspected illegal disposal of waste occurring there. Or three, if the facility is suspected of contaminating a drinking water supply and either there is no monitoring program in place or the existing monitoring program in place was deemed inadequate, for example, if it did not include testing for emerging contaminants. The program was broken into 5 distinct tasks. Task 1 was a preliminary assessment of the sites. This essentially was a large data gathering step. It included a records review, confirmation of the landfill location, and a site reconnaissance and inspection. Task 2 consisted of a ranking system. In collaborative effort with the state, the unique ranking system was established to prioritize investigations, starting with those having the highest potential risk to public health or the environment. The ranking system incorporated the data that we collected in Task 1 to conduct that comparative analysis. Following that ranking or that prioritization, Task 3 calls for the site investigations, starting with the highest risk landfills based on the ranking system. These investigations include a hydrogeological analysis to evaluate groundwater flow paths, the collection of groundwater samples at the site for laboratory analysis for select parameters, and where warranted, expansion of that investigation to include down gradient drinking water supply sampling. Tasks 4 and 5 focus on setting mitigation and remediation priorities where impacts to drinking water supplies are found, and ultimately reporting back to the governor and the legislature. So for the next few slides, I'll focus on tasks 1 through 3 in a little bit more detail. So task 1, the overall objective was to build a statewide inventory and database of knowledge and information on the inactive solid waste sites and landfills across the state. The need for this was driven by several factors. One, that there was a very large discrepancy in the amount of information available from site to site. The nature of that information often was in a vulnerable state, so it could be paper copies that could be at risk for being damaged or lost. And then thirdly, the loss of institutional knowledge within state employees due to retirement, which was a big risk for losing information and data and history of some of those sites. So consolidating all into one knowledge base was deemed pretty critical. This task involved a review of massive quantities of data, which included paper files, historical aerial photos, interviews with site owners or municipal employees, such as local highway department personnel, review of newspaper clippings, really any information that we could find. In some cases, we were dealing with sites that were well known and identified. In other cases, we had a 30-year-old piece of paper in a file documenting a complaint of dumping. In this data search, we were looking for any information about the landfill operation and construction, such as its history, when it started and stopped accepting waste materials, if any sort of construction details we could find, there was hydrogeologic site conditions available, if there were existing monitoring wells or seep locations or existing monitoring programs, and any data they may have. In some cases, simply confirming that a landfill existed was necessary, and in many more, defining the exact footprints and specific locations was needed. Ultimately, this step culminated with a site inspection encompassing all 1,900 plus landfills. Those site inspections proved to be a pretty extensive effort that was completed by a combination of New York State DEC and Parsons personnel starting in 2017 and wrapping up in early 2019. There's two primary objectives of the inspections. First, populating that statewide database, which was ultimately intended to be the vessel and knowledge of these sites going forward. And then two, the second to provide data for task two, which was the site ranking process. There were some key pieces of information that we were looking for during these site inspections. We wanted to verify the records review findings and update information on property ownership, access, and contact. We needed to confirm the existence and location and aerial expanse of the landfill. We were also looking for site conditions. Was there a landfill cap? What condition was it in? Are there seeps? Are there signs of erosion? We also performed an inspection of any existing monitoring wells that might be there to assess them if they would be suitable for us to sample down the road. Moving on now to task two, this focused on setting a prioritization of the sites upon which the advancement of site investigations could be based. Generally speaking, most sites did not have what we considered a reliable and comprehensive operational data. So that was something we had to work around. Additionally, we really wanted to make this as objective as possible. So the ranking was process primarily focused on what we consider verifiable site factors. Ultimately, there were four primary categories of criteria that were determined to be significant enough to influence whether a site could be contributing to impacts of drinking water sources. The first category was the general proximity to site potential receptors. This included a physical location relative to homes, businesses, and other facilities. It also accounted for the proximity to public water or private water supplies. And for these ranking questions that fell within this category, higher scores were given to closer homes or water supplies that were, say, a quarter mile away versus ones that were a mile away. The second category included the landfill characteristics themselves, included the nature of the waste, whether it was C&D, municipal waste, industrial waste, whether there was a cap or cover system in place, and that was used to assess the potential for offsite migration of potential contaminants based on infiltration of surface water. And then we also looked at if the landfill had a fully constructed impermeable cap or grass cover or no cover at all with exposed waste or exposed soil. And then we also looked at physical properties such as the size, slope, and general grading of the site. The third category was the geologic setting, which that was focused on whether the site was situated in a location which could be more or less conducive to contaminants migrating down gradient, relatively speaking. This considered site stratigraphy, the permeability of the underlying materials, the depth of the groundwater, with the highest ranking scores in that category assigned to waste being known to be in the groundwater. And then the final category were general site conditions. And this included an accounting of whether there were seeps noted at the site, if there was existing monitoring data from wells that we could look at to indicate if, at the bare minimum, whether leachate or other typical landfill indicators were found, and then the condition of the cap if it was present. In addition to these criteria, we had several yes/no questions, which were determined to be pertinent enough to factor into the weighting of the site, but didn't really fit into the normal matrix of the other criteria. These included items such as whether the site was closed after 1988 as part of a Part 360 closure, whether the site was located in a sensitive watershed, such as a primary or sole source aquifer, and whether there was a noted history of disposal of sensitive materials, such as fire retardant or fire impacted materials. Ultimately, with the ranking system, the maximum potential score was 124, although you'll see here that the highest maximum score that we actually saw was quite a bit lower with a score of 84. The graph here shows the general distribution of that statewide ranking process. We were generally pretty pleased with the bell-shaped curve nature of these results. There is a little bit of an anomaly, as you can see, towards the left-hand side, towards the lower end of the scale. This was largely due to sites in Region 2 of New York State, which is the New York City area. There was a handful of specific conditions which applied to most sites within this region, where the city is serviced by a municipal water supply, and there really is little or to no potential for the use of groundwater for drinking water purposes. Ultimately, we felt that this gave us a good starting point for us to start prioritizing sites for groundwater investigations. Site investigations were initiated in 2017. The initial batch of sites were identified by the DEC, which typically consisted of sites where the department had specific reason to suspect or anticipate that groundwater could be impacted. Investigations at these sites actually began before the ranking system was finalized, which actually came to provide us with some important data points later on in our evaluations. In 2018, additional sites were added, this time using the highest ranked sites from the ranking system. And then annually thereafter, we've been adding sites to the list each year, encompassing increasingly lower ranked sites. Now, these investigations are probably what you could consider preliminary site characterizations. They typically consist of 3 to 5 locations of groundwater sampling, either sampling from existing or new wells that we installed specifically for the program. To date, we've installed more than 1,000 wells at more than 250 sites, and we've completed the sampling at about 440 of the sites as of the end of March 2023. Just on the data side, real quick, as I mentioned, the program is focused on emerging contaminants, so we are analyzing groundwater samples for PFAS and 1,4-dioxane. We also include VOCs, SVOCs, metals, and leachate parameters. And all of the data that we generate is managed through New York State's preferred data management software, which is EQUIS. In looking at our results to date, we have found that the presence of PFAS compounds is very prevalent at these sites, where we've detected it at more than 96% of our sites. Now, New York State has established MCLs, or maximum contaminant levels, for numerous compounds in drinking water. For PFOA and PFOS, those MCL levels are 10 parts per trillion for each compound. And for 1,4-dioxane, it's 1 part per billion. Exceedance of these MCLs for PFOA and or PFOS was found at more than 68% of the wells of the sites that we've assessed to date. On the 1,4-dioxane side, we find that a lot less prevalent. We don't detect that at all. We haven't detected that at all at more than a third of our sites, and we've only exceeded the MCLs at about 26% of the sites. We've done a number of different types of correlation analyses for these, and to date, we have not found a specific correlation between exceedances or detections of 1,4-dioxane and PFAS, so they seem independent of each other. Once we receive that groundwater data, we proceed to the next step of our investigation, which is to look at whether it's warranted to expand our investigation to look at drinking water supplies. So there's a very simple flow chart that we follow that we've outlined on this slide. Basically, the first question is, does the groundwater data exceed the MCLs for the emerging contaminants of target, PFOA, PFOS, or 1,4-dioxane? If we do not, we generally take no further action on the program and move on. If we do find groundwater in exceedance of the MCLs, we trigger what we call the receptor identification and sampling process. There's 3 steps to this. A process to identify any potential downwater drinking water receptors. Those could be private homes, those could be public water supplies, commercial facilities, receptor outreach, which includes a mailing and a request to allow us to sample, and then the actual sampling process. Now here, I'll hand it off to Heather Budzik to walk through the rest of these processes and the remainder of the presentation.
So I'm going to start with the receptor identification process. So Parsons has worked collaboratively with the department and the Department of New York State DEC and the Department of Health, taking a series of steps to identify both private, public, and municipal sources of drinking water in the vicinity of the landfill in question. Typically, the process involves reviewing or querying publicly available geographic information system databases, reviewing available tax map data, consulting with the department for any institutional information that they may have on a landfill, and sometimes consulting with local regulatory agencies or municipalities. So the figure that you see on the screen is a typical depiction used for a landfill going through the receptor ID process. So the green polygon in the center is used to illustrate the boundary limits of the landfill. The white ChemBox plots that you see circling the landfill are used to show analytical results from groundwater samples collected from monitoring wells at the landfill. For the receptor identification process, we're typically looking to identify receptors within a 1/4 mile to a 1/2 mile radius around the landfill. And that's sort of indicated by the dark blue and lighter blue hatch circles that you see circling the landfill. Once potential receptors and drinking water sources have been identified, a hydrogeological evaluation is completed to evaluate and identify the general down gradient flow area or potential contaminant flow area, and that's shown by the yellow hatched area on this particular slide. The potential receptors are overlaid on the figure. In this case, we're using blue circles and blue triangles to identify potential receptors, and you can see their proximity and distance away from the landfill. The blue circles are indicating properties for which at least some portion of the tax parcel that it's representing is located within the groundwater flow path. And ultimately, those parcels will be advanced into the receptor outreach program and solicited for sampling. Next slide, please. So for the receptors that we want to reach out to and canvas, we utilize letters that are sent on behalf of DEC and the Department of Health. The letters are basically offering to sample the water supply well on their property and lets them know who to contact so that they can schedule the sampling. So it provides contact information not only for Parsons, but also for the department, so that if they'd rather ask or direct their questions to the department, they have that contact information. In some cases where we're not receiving much response by either the letters or sometimes phone call methods, we've implemented hang tag procedures so that we could reach out to property owners in that way as well. Next slide, please. So the next step in the process is to complete the sampling for those receptors who responded to the public outreach. Sampling is conducted for 1,4-dioxane and a select group of PFAS compounds and any additional compounds which exhibited exceedances in monitoring wells at the landfill. Generally speaking, the sampling is focused on untreated water from a well, ideally at the closest point of entry to where it comes into the house. If a property has an advanced treatment system in place, such as a reverse osmosis system, then sometimes we'll collect a water sample before and after the treatment system so that we have some additional data to share with the DEC and the Department of Health to formulate recommendations in a path forward. Of course, this program has evolved through the COVID years, through which people had a wide variety of comfort level with having our teams enter their homes. In many cases, sampling from an outdoor spigot became the preferred method, though we had to make sure, of course, that we weren't sampling through someone's garden hose. Next slide, please. Today, we've conducted drinking water sampling at more than 1,200 locations. We typically have a response rate of about 50% to our public outreach and solicitation efforts. Despite the results from the groundwater investigations that Tom presented earlier, we're seeing significantly fewer impacts in drinking water. So the figure on the screen is showing 2 sets of data. The blue bars are representing groundwater results from samples collected from monitoring wells at the landfills, and the orange bars are representing drinking water samples from the down gradient receptors. The 2 bars to the left are showing detections at landfills where we're seeing concentrations of PFOA and or PFOS above the MCLs. And to the right, you're seeing the same set of data, but for 1,4-dioxane. So the results essentially are showing that where we're seeing PFAS detections and exceedance at landfills at about 68%, we're only seeing detections in the down gradient drinking water sources at about 16% of the locations sampled. And for 1,4-dioxane, we're seeing 26% of the landfills sampled are having detections of 1,4-dioxane above the MCL, compared to only 2% of the down gradient receptors demonstrating exceedances above the MCLs. Once results are received, the Department of Health discusses the results with the homeowners and will discuss any recommendations they have specific to that location. Depending on the results, the recommendations might vary between no further action, additional resampling efforts, or potential mitigation. Next slide, please. So if we just step back for a second and recall that the objectives of the ILI program under Title 12 are twofold. And as Tom mentioned earlier, the first objective was to evaluate and prioritize solid waste sites based on their potential impact on the state's drinking water supply sources and subsequent impact to public health. So essentially, the program is focused on evaluating the overall risk to drinking water resources. And that's essentially what we've covered up to date. We've talked through the ranking and prioritization of the sites, conducting the groundwater sampling, and for those demonstrating impacts, conducting the receptor identification process and subsequent drinking water sampling. The second objective under the ILI program is to make specific recommendations for additional steps, such as further investigation at a landfill, additional monitoring, or remediation and mitigation. The recommendations are developed into a mitigation and remediation priority list that is assembled as part of our annual report to the governor and legislature. To date, the program has identified 34 sites to be referred through the agency's processes to the Division of Environmental Remediation, so a separate division within the New York State DEC. The sites that are referred include sites where elevated concentrations of PFAS or 1,4-dioxane have been found in the groundwater samples collected at the landfill, or where multiple drinking water exceedances have been found down gradient. So most of the sites that have been referred are early on or in early stages of subsequent investigation. Some examples of potential preliminary mitigation or remedial measures that could be implemented at a site would include things like providing alternate drinking water supply to the property owner in the form of bottled water, installation of point of entry treatment systems or POET systems, and in some cases, the mitigation or remediation might involve changes at the landfill itself, such as stormwater diversion efforts, making repairs to a landfill cap, improving the leachate collection system, or some sort of subsurface diversion for receptors. Implementation of a statewide emerging contaminant program is complex. However, with the right task flows, standard operating procedures, resources, project support, schedule, and communication methods, a program can be effectively managed while minimizing disruption or interferences. So we mirrored the program following the New York State DEC's division of the state into 9 different regions. So the New York State DEC has identified a lead geologist for each region within the state. On Parsons' side, we grouped the regions into clusters of 3 and assigned a regional coordinator to manage 3 regions within close proximity to one another. It's a fairly open and collaborative relationship between Parsons regional coordinators and the New York State lead geologists. And of course, there's upward communication and reporting to the program managers on each side of the table. In addition, Parsons has an extensive support team consisting of geologists who provide drilling oversight. We have groundwater sampling teams, a survey team that goes out to survey any of the monitoring wells that are installed. We have a data management and validation team, drinking water sampling teams, hydrogeologists and GIS specialists that help with the receptor identification process, and of course, support from procurement as we have drillers and laboratories under contract. Standardization across the program was critical to ensuring the success of the program. This is particularly important as program staff change or grow out of the program, or they get pulled into other projects. Recall that we've been working on this program since 2017. So factoring in some type of standardization so that we could transfer the institutional knowledge that we've gained on the project to newer staff coming in was critical. One of the things that we did was to develop program-wide documents, including a field sampling plan, quality assurance project plan, and health and safety plan. Additionally, we developed standardized templates for conducting site inspections. We have templates that could be used to document any of our drilling observations, groundwater sampling records, even field sampling reports that get written up after an investigation is complete. So anything that we do on any site in any region throughout the state is all done systematically using these templates. Furthermore, several standard operating procedures were developed to provide the basis and justification for implementing critical phases and steps and to ensure consistency program-wide. As I said before, not only is this important to set a standard of quality across the more than 1,900 sites that we are being investigated, but it serves as a reference document by field teams. So some of the SOPs that we developed, as Tom spoke about already, we had the ranking and prioritization system in place so that each site could be ranked equally, or not equally, but in the same systematic process. We had a procedure in place for evaluating and identifying downgradient receptors. We also had a procedure for implementing community outreach efforts to offer the drinking water sampling in private residences. And we had a procedure established for sampling private drinking water sources and or public water sources when identified. In addition to weekly meetings between the DEC and Parsons program manager, we also maintain, update, and manage a biweekly Excel spreadsheet that we use to monitor and track the status of each landfill that's going through the investigation. So this tracking spreadsheet is basically set up by year, and it identifies any site that's currently being investigated. And the spreadsheet, as you can imagine, mirrors the flow of the talk today. It talks about, whether a site's gone through a site inspection, if it's been ranked, if drilling has been completed, or maybe you're still working on getting permission. Has groundwater sampling been completed? If so, do we have the analytical results? If we have the analytical results, what do they say? Are there exceedances above MCLs? If there are, is the drinking water assessment being completed, and what status is that at? So that's our tool for sort of keeping track of the fluid changes throughout the program on each site. Tom talked about this a little bit also. We developed an access database so that we could have an integrated electronic repository for each site. One of the key things that we set up early on was to assign a unique database ID number for every landfill within the program. There's a group of 3 sites in Region 3 that they're all extremely similar and could be easily confused just looking at them superficially on a piece of paper. I think they're called East Fishkill, Landfill East, and Fishkill / East Fishkill. And they're all 3 completely different sites and can be so quickly confused that without that database ID number, we've seen it happen. So we have assigned the unique database ID number, and basically this access database is, as Tom pointed out, an electronic repository for any information that we found on a landfill is now consolidated into this a digitized format. So it contains information as simple as the facility address and coordinates, property owner's information and address, any information that was obtained during the site inspections. So characteristics of the landfill, the size, the type of waste disposed, presence of seeps, any critical information that we gleaned from the hard copy file reviews. All that stuff is in one consolidated place now, instead of being spread out through various regional offices. It also incorporates any institutional knowledge that we've acquired through conversations with the department. One other major behind the scenes item developed for the program was a file management system to organize the electronic files. So again, you can imagine all the sites going through the investigation process. We're generating all different types of files. We're trying to develop a way to manage and track, if we have permission at a site to conduct drilling. If we've drilled, then we'd have boring logs, well development logs, community air monitoring data. If we're conducting groundwater sampling, there should be groundwater sampling records. There's all types of analytical data files. If a site has to go through the drinking water assessment phase, then there's different files that get generated as part of the receptor identification process, such as the figure that I showed earlier. There's survey files. If a site has monitoring wells that have been installed and need to be surveyed, there's records to go along with that. So this library is basically another place to consolidate electronic files and be able to readily share them with the department. At this point, we're developing a new version of the library on a semi-annual basis. We've completed our 8th version. We'll be submitting the 9th version this coming January. And to date, we've generated just over 20,000 electronic files for the program. Being such a large program, certainly there were challenges to overcome and lessons learned. So I'll share just a few of those with you. First and foremost, the DEC and the program has had to retool several times to account for the rapidly evolving approach to addressing PFAS compounds in the environment, including changes to sampling methods, analytical methods, making sure that laboratories could meet the low detection limits, that we had to make sure that the laboratories were able to accommodate changes to PFAS analyte lists and updating guidance values. And that, of course, continues to challenge us as there are now several new proposed MCLs being considered by the state. Second, we've had a number of locations, Tom talked about this earlier, where the location was not known, and it proved challenging to try and confirm the existence of that landfill. And essentially, we had to do a deeper dive, implement some additional desktop resources, review some aerial imagery, tax records, sometimes even try to dig through historic newspapers to identify or glean any information we could about a landfill. Site access has proved to be challenging from both a physical and a legal standpoint. In some cases, property owners have been reluctant to give us access to a landfill. Maybe they weren't interested in signing a written access agreement. In some cases, we were able to negotiate verbal access to gain access to the landfill. But we found overall that in engaging the property owners early on in the process and trying to build a relationship with them, establish trust, gain their confidence, and try to address any questions or concerns that they had as early on as possible, that seemed to be more beneficial and help us in the long run to negotiate the access agreements. In some cases, we had physical challenges preventing us from maybe using a certain type of drilling equipment. So we had to be ready and able to modify the type of drilling equipment we were using, including using the use of ATV mounted drill rigs. In a couple of cases, we had to install wells using hand augers. In another case, physical access proved to be problematic to install a well. I don't know if it was the upgrading or downgrading side of the landfill, but we were able to negotiate access with an adjacent property owner and install a well near the property line, and we were able to overcome the access challenge that way. Availability of drilling crews was problematic early on in the program, given that we were trying to arrange drilling at multiple sites using multiple crews. And we found that the best way to overcome that was to try and gain access to a block of sites at any given time. So instead of securing access to one site and then letting the drilling teams and field teams go off to one site, we would block off access to 6, 8, 10, sometimes 12 sites, so that you have like a longer run time for the work that's being scheduled. So that was useful not only for the drillers to manage their resources, but also for Parsons to manage our resources and scheduling. And the last thing, this is sort of repetitive, but it's data management. So again, this program is a massive data collection process where we're not just collecting analytical data and groundwater samples and drinking water results, but again, it's that from the beginning, like the first piece of data was really like all the research and inventory and records review and putting all that information into one consolidated place. So that was the first piece of data that had to be managed, and that's in the Access database. The other file system or data management tool that we've already talked about was the library, which is the place where all the electronic files being generated for the program are managed. And lastly, I think Tom alluded to this also, but with the thousands of samples being collected to date across hundreds of sites for both groundwater and drinking water, we do have a document repository for the analytical data, and that's essentially the DEC's EQUIS database. So we have a place to manage all that data, and one key piece I guess, quality control measure that we implemented early on in the program to manage the analytical data was to develop a consistent and standardized way to name the sample, so the sample nomenclature, and also for filling out and completing chain of custody records. Overall, the program continues. We have another 550 sites in the investigation queue, with more being added on an annual basis. We continue our flow of drinking water assessments as required based on groundwater results, and we continue to add sites to our priority list for investigation and to DEC for remediation and mitigation if warranted. With that, it concludes our presentation, and Tom and I would be happy to address any questions you have.
Thanks, Heather and Tom. It was a great presentation. If there's any questions, you can either enter them into the chat and we'll read them out, or you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you to ask your question. So I see Chris O'Neill has his hand raised. You should be able to unmute yourself now and ask your question.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, you mentioned data management as kind of the biggest challenge within this program, and I absolutely get that. But one of the things that you mentioned that I was really curious about is the tracking, specifically letters tracked, calls, and hang tags. Is the system for tracking something that's managed within Parsons' side, or is that done at the DEC level? Like how are you guys managing that, and where do the metrics for monitoring letters and calls, like where does that go for this program?
Yeah, all of that is, thanks for the question, Chris. All of that is tracked on the Parsons side, and at a site by site basis. So that focus list that is agreed to by everybody, all the parties involved, DEC, DOH, and Parsons, spurs what we call a call log, and so that's actually a database file that several folks have access to, so that when calls come in, anybody can go in and that fields the call and start to enter in information of the caller that they're interested in sampling, what their address is, and any other pertinent information that we call. So those call logs and the focus lists themselves, we use those to track when the letters were sent, what letters may have come back to us undeliverable, how many times have we mailed letters to an individual set of locations, did we get calls, did they want sampling, did they say don't ever call us again, and so all that is tracked and then kind of rolled up in a number of different ways to kind of help us not only look at things from a site level, but from a program standpoint, what we're doing is what we're doing effective from an outreach standpoint. Are there clusters of sites or locations where we're getting very little return on letters, but more success on the hang tags, that kind of thing.
So that's a project team lead effort.
It is.
That's
Yep.
dedicated just for this project. Okay.
Yep.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Okay, I see we have a few questions in the chat. The first one is from Les Cordone. Do we think that the state will change the receptor analysis for their action requirement when the MCL for PFAS drops to the currently proposed federal standard of 4 nanograms per liter for PFOA PFAS?
Well, I certainly can't speak for the state, but I would anticipate that they would likely defer to and defer to the lower numbers from the federal that from the Fed. We have not had specific discussions of if and when those happen and what the response would be, but they've generally tracked with those EPA numbers, and I think their philosophy generally has been they'll be as conservative in those as the federal government is. So I would expect yes, I guess less.
Okay, next question is from Ron Crosscheck. For the ranking and site prioritization, how was the weighting factor of 3 selected?
Yeah, so the folks may have seen on the ranking sheet that I had flashed up on the slide there. The ranking criteria were kind of given a weighting factor of 1, 2, or 3, and those generally translated to the range of scores that a particular question allowed for. So a site rank weighting factor of 3, your scoring might be 0, 3, 6, or 9 points, whereas a weighting factor of 1 criteria might score 0, 1, 2, or 3 points. And there was a few things that went into that. Generally speaking, I mentioned we really wanted to focus on verifiable data, verifiable information. And so while you would think something like waste type it would be relatively important for that kind of analysis, that data that we had for it was highly, either missing or unreliable, or just, I don't want to say wrong, but we know that we've seen landfills where they're land clearing debris, or basically should be just organic material dumped there. We've seen emerging contaminant impacts there. So that there was something dumped there other than just stumps and brush. And so pull that back, we knew that waste characterization data was not necessarily accurate. So we didn't want to give too much weight to data that we didn't know could be 100% accurate. So it was a function of which criteria could we, provide a verifiable answer for, and then just professional judgment of, okay, which of these factors are going to contribute more heavily to the potential risk that a site may have on a drinking water supply versus another.
Okay, we have a few more questions in the chat. This sounds very similar to our work in Fayetteville. Who is handling communication with the residents regarding sampling results and possible mitigation?
So the Department of Health handles all of the discussions with the property owners once the residential sampling data is obtained. So we'll get a copy of that data as it comes in from the laboratory, and that gets shared with the DEC and the Department of Health. The Department of Health then takes that data, formulates a recommendation letter that gets sent to the property owners, and then they have a phone call to walk through what the results were, what the recommendations have, address any concerns or questions they may have. So all that is done through the Department of Health.
Next question is from Andrea Sansom. Did the PA and site scoring correlate to sites with exceedances? Was drinking water only sampled if the landowners used private wells?
Jess, could you repeat the first part of that question again?
Yeah, did the PA, so I think preliminary assessment, and
Okay.
site scoring correlate to sites with exceedances?
Okay, so, and then the second part of that was
was drinking water only sampled if the landowners used private wells?
okay, yeah. So the second part of that question, yes, we did not sample a property owner if they were on a public water supply that was already kind of monitored on a regular basis. Most large water supplies within the state are monitored regularly for emerging contaminants. Now, every once in a while, we will encounter some relatively small public water supplies within our focus lists or our down gradient flow areas, and those might be a small public water supply that's supplying water to a handful of mobile homes or something like that. So in those cases, we would sample those individual locations, but not if they are on a kind of a large municipal water supply. And I guess I still didn't quite get the first part of that question. I'm sorry, Jess.
No, it's okay. Did the PA and site scoring correlate to sites with exceedances?
Okay, understood. So yeah, we have done a number of correlation analyses to try to understand or see if there's any patterns between how the sites ranked and how not only what their ranking score was, but how did certain ranking criteria fall. We identified a handful of early on, a handful of factors that we found held a more positive correlation between kind of a yes type of question and whether they exceeded the MCLs in groundwater. I think that resulted in some additions to our investigation list in 2019, where we found, okay, there's a strong correlation between emerging contaminants in groundwater and, for example, waste found in groundwater. That was one of our what we called positive factors. And so what we subsequently did was any of the other sites remaining in the investigation list that had that fit that criteria, those were actually bumped up regardless of their score and added to our investigation list. So beyond I guess those positive correlation factors, I can't really say that we can't really say that there's as we've gotten lower into through the process, we do see our numbers starting to drift down. I think in the first year our percent exceedances of MCLs may have been in the 70 or 72%. We're starting to see that drift down to 68%. So I think you can glean from that as we get down and through the ranking score to lower and lower sites, we are seeing it less frequently. As that number of sites builds, obviously the number of sites, it's going to take a bigger number of sites to move that percentage lower, just because you're dealing with a bigger data set. But generally speaking, it seems like we are starting to see some decline in the number of sites exceeding the MCLs.
I see Kyla Wyatt. Let me unmute you.
Hello.
Hi, Kyla.
Sorry. No, there's a little technical glitch there. Sorry about
Sorry.
that.
All right, I'm back. I have a bit of a two-part question. So for the landfills that were investigated, what types of wastes were associated with these facilities? And have you noticed any trends in the results of your investigation based on the waste at the facilities investigated?
So these landfills encompass just about every type of waste that you could think of. So there was C&D, construction demolition debris, landfills, industrial, municipal waste, land clearing debris, landfills. Generally speaking, I'd say in a lot of cases, the nature of the waste disposed of at a site, more often than not, is not known with 100% confidence. And so with that, I think it's been a little bit of a difficult thing to connect certain waste types to more or less frequently, detecting emerging contaminants above MCLs. So I'd say, we at this point we have not established that correlation. We do see, emerging contaminant exceedances through, across all waste types, generally speaking.
I see we've got a few more questions in the chat from Hao Zhang. Have remediation measures been taken for the highly impacted areas based on groundwater monitoring results? And if so, what actions have been taken?
Yeah, I think Heather touched on this one. To date, I think most of those sites that have been referred out of this program are still sort of in the early stages of being evaluated further by the state. And so at this point, no remedial actions have been taken at the landfill themselves. There have been sites where drinking water has been provided to specific residents or groups of residents because their wells have been found to be impacted. In a handful of sites, that we've found maybe a cluster, a bigger size cluster of homes. I think actions are underway to sort of evaluate, maybe by the local municipality, of expanding a public water supply into those areas. And so there have been actions taken at that sort of level, but at this point, remedial actions associated with the landfills themselves has not happened yet.
Okay, then we got a question from Glenn Ulrich. Can you deduce from the results if the landfills are an active source of PFAS versus a historical source?
That's a good question, Glenn. I think I don't know that we can deduce that. Given I'd say the age of these landfills in most cases, and the general proximity of the wells, I would say it's probably fair to say that they are in most cases active contributing, sources of PFAS. I'm trying to think if there's any examples where we may have seen something that may run counter to that. But no, I think it's fair to say, based on proximity and the levels that we're seeing, they are still active. While there's certainly not active waste being disposed of at these facilities, whatever's in there is continuing to leach into the groundwater.
I see a question from Christy Diller. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Hey, Tom, you mentioned sampling groundwater from existing monitoring wells. I've worked on other projects where there was concern from the client or stakeholders regarding potential PFAS cross-contamination from the original well installation methods or previous use of downhole equipment, which might have contained PFAS. Were any special procedures used for this program to ensure you were getting a representative PFAS groundwater sample from those existing?
Yeah. So when we do use existing groundwater monitoring wells, we generally will redevelop those wells. In most cases, we won't. There's no equipment down there, and so there's no concern of, equipment that may have some materials that could be PFAS or emerging contaminant containing. We have had a couple of sites where there was existing pumping equipment down those wells. I think in those cases, kind of an assessment was made. Okay, do we pull that equipment, just knowing that it could contain a bladder pump that may have PFAS in it, or do we pull that equipment and redevelop that well? I think in the one instance I can think of, I think we actually elected to just install new wells out of concern for that. So it's certainly something we're aware of, Christy. Where we don't have existing equipment down those wells, we're comfortable with just redeveloping those wells, but where we do have that existing equipment, in the past, historically, we've decided to install new wells.
Okay, good to know. Thanks.
So another question in the chat from Kim Vetter. How do you address landfills with a house on them if they are dependent on groundwater and yet their overall score does not put them at the top of the list?
So that is not a unique occurrence. We have encountered several locations like that, places where we've got homes or developments actually on top of landfills. Generally speaking, those locations did pop to the top of the ranking criteria for a handful of reasons, and they were basically treated as the rest were, to the extent that we could install groundwater wells around the property. We would not sample if a home had I don't recall a situation where a home had a drinking water source through the landfill itself. I think in cases where we had properties on top of the landfill, they may have been supplied by a water supply, but we would never sample somebody's drinking water supply as a groundwater well, generally speaking. But based on the ranking criteria, house or mobile home park, which was very common on top of landfill, the criteria did tend to bring those properties up to the ranking score, and a lot of them have been investigated to date.
Then one more question in the chat from Hannah Annunziata. Having worked on some of the receptor evaluations, I recall some sites where offsite sources are possible based on elevated concentrations in upgrading wells and known sources of PFAS nearby. What does the DEC do when offsite sources are possible?
Yeah, that we've had a handful of landfills that we've investigated, and we've found impacts in the groundwater. So one of the steps that's taken is collaboration. We're primarily working with the Division of Materials Management on this. When we get sites that are in close proximity to kind of active sites that might be being investigated by the Division of Environmental Remediation, there's a kind of active collaboration between DMM and DER to identify where those sites are, especially as we get sites that may have elevated concentrations, higher than sort of the normal range that we see. those will actually be kind of analyzed, and we've had a handful where we've referred them over to DER, and they've come back to say, yeah, this falls within a bigger area that's being investigated, and so we don't believe this is the source. We believe this is just downgradient of this other property, and so that comes with collaboration between DER and DMM to look at sort of a bigger perspective where these sites are located.
Okay, if there's any more questions, you can, actually, one last question. If you have any more questions beyond this, you can email them directly to Tom and Heather after the webinar. From Hao Zhang, for the data management system, is it a company-wide database that can be utilized for other projects?
Yeah, so the Equus database that we use, Parsons has a license to use Equus, and so we actively use that on behalf of DEC and other clients as well. And so there are several individuals kind of use that on a regular basis. So that's kind of the analytical data method. Microsoft Access is an application that, of course, we all have access to. That's the primary function of the landfill database that we use, which is all of the historical information.
Okay, I think with that, we'll wrap it up at the top of the hour. So a link to the form for PDH credit, if you'd like it, has been posted. If you had any issues accessing that form or that link, please let us know and we'll get that to you. And if you missed any of the content or just want to go back and review it, the recording of this webinar should be posted on our YouTube channel in the next few days. Our next webinar will be on November the 8th, presented by Tracy Opie and Chrissy Diller on advances in in-situ treatment technologies for 1,4-dioxane remediation. Thank you to everybody who joined us for today's webinar, and we hope to see you again in November.